Hello, welcome to How to Teach Science to Your Elementary Students. My name is Paige Hudson, and I've authored more than 20 books to help homeschoolers just like you teach science. But more than that, I've also homeschooled my own 2 children. So you've made the decision to homeschool your precious little one. But you have a lingering doubt about this choice, the fear that you won't be able to teach science. You're not alone. Sure, you made it through your science classes, but you didn't really enjoy them. Or to be honest, you don't remember a thing you studied. But you know that research says the earlier you introduce science, especially in this day and age, the more chances your student will be successful with the subject. Well, the good news is that teaching science to elementary students is simply a matter of sparking their interest. And today we're going to chat about the 3 key things you need for each week and how you can weave those into your unique homeschool. Sound good? Let's dig in. Let's start with the story of how we started homeschooling. So we have 2 children, as I said before. They're about 8 years apart. So we had our precious little one, and we had planned on eventually moving overseas. And rather than putting her in school, we thought, well, we'll try this great experiment of homeschooling, since we're going to have to do it when we move anyways. So we started homeschooling when she was about 4 years old. I know I was a little ambitious. But we started with light school when she was about 4 or 5 years old. And we loved it so much, loved having that family time together and doing life together and education together, that we continued homeschooling all the way through high school. And she has now graduated and off at college. And then our youngest one came along 8 years later, and he is the extrovert in a family of introverts. But that's okay. And there was no question we were going to homeschool him as well. And I'm really glad we did, because he is all boy. And to be honest, if he had had to sit at a desk when he was 5 years old, it would not have gone so well. So I didn't really grow up intending to homeschool. My mother was an elementary teacher, and I got my degree in science. And so I love science and thought I'd do something in research. But then I fell in love and got married. And when we had our children, I thought, you know what? I want to stay with these kids as much as I can. And when we started homeschooling, I started looking around for science curriculum and just couldn't find anything that made science come alive, that made me excited about teaching my favorite subject. So that's how I kind of fell into all of what I do with the podcast at Tips for Homeschool Science Show and the programs that we've written at Elemental Science. So we are still homeschooling. Our youngest is now going into he's in 4th grade, going into 5th. And then, like I said, our oldest graduated. So let's talk about elementary science. We like to say that your elementary student is an empty bucket waiting to be filled with knowledge. So we agree that the emphasis of the elementary years should definitely be on those basic skills. But that doesn't mean that we should neglect science during this time. Because you see, our elementary students are full of wonder, and they have an innate desire to know everything about everything. If you have an elementary student in your house, my guess is you frequently hear questions like, "What's this?" or "What's that?" These kiddos are curious little buggers, and we want to capitalize on that natural curiosity by showing them how much fun science can be. Because when we teach science early on, it paves the way for an easier time with science in future years. So by the time our kiddos reach the elementary years, they're ready to participate in more formal school lessons. Usually this happens around 6 years old. But don't worry if you have a more active child who needs to move and learn at the same time. You can still teach short lessons in the basics in science. And these elementary years kind of end when the student starts to change from wanting to know what to wanting to know why and how. It's a subtle change, and it usually happens around 10, 11, 12 years old. You'll know it when it comes. Either way, it's important to share about science during these elementary years. So what are your goals for teaching science? Well, like I said before, the elementary student is an empty bucket that's begging to be filled. So your first goal is going to be to spark an interest, to create that interest, to spark a desire for learning science. We want our students to see that science is fun and interesting. We want them to enjoy the basic facts and spark a desire to dig in and learn more. And although experiments aren't everyone's favorites, doing hands-on science activities goes a long way in helping you create an interest in science. So the second goal that we have is to fill our students' mind with interesting but basic scientific information. So we want to begin to build a scientific knowledge base in our students, something that they can reference to make a hypothesis or something that they can build and draw upon in later years. Of course, you can always use science to shore up their basic skills of writing and reading at this age, but really be careful not to push too hard. You don't want them to end up hating science because the reading material was too challenging or because the writing was too cumbersome. So in short, your elementary kiddos are learning the fundamentals of the 3 R's, writing, reading, and arithmetic. But this is also a great time to share with them the basics of science. You want to create an interest and fill their bucket with interesting scientific facts. Okay? So now that we kind of understand what our goals are, let's chat a little bit about the 3 keys to teaching science. So I like to boil teaching science down to 3 things, 3 keys that you need to do each and every week. So the first of those keys is hands-on. So you need to do something that presents the face of science. So your students need to see or play with or observe science in action. The second thing they need to do is gather information. So you need to get information from a reliable source, and then you need to record that information. So they need to write it down in some way. So let's take a closer look at those 3 keys. So I like to say that experiments are the flesh of science. This is our chance to show our kiddos what science is all about. So I can say to my student, if you drop a ball, it will fall to the ground because of gravity. And they might remember that, and they might understand what gravity is. They might have head knowledge of that. But if I give them a ball and ask them to let go, they're going to know that ball drops to the ground. Then it's much easier for me to come back and say, hey, the reason that's happening is because of gravity. And they'll be more meaningful because now they can connect an experience with a piece of knowledge. So that's why we really want to do some kind of hands-on. So experiments in the typical sense. So what can you use in the elementary years? We don't need to use full-blown experiments where we're answering a question and doing research and coming up with a hypothesis and doing all those things. Our kiddos in elementary years, they're not ready for that yet. So we're going to do something called scientific demonstrations. These are parent-led and student-observed. Does that mean your kiddos can't take part in science experiments and things like that? Heavens no. Does that mean they can't guess at what's going to happen? No. But we're not going to call that a hypothesis, and we're not going to expect them to be the driving force behind their hands-on activities. Instead, we're going to be the ones who are presenting them with the hands-on activities. We're going to be right there with them, doing it with them, talking about what we should see, talking about what we didn't see, and really explaining the concepts and spoon-feeding them scientific knowledge through the demonstration. So if you've got a good curriculum, it's going to help you do that. The other thing you can use in addition to scientific demonstrations is nature study. So nature study is simply finding science in nature. So you go out, you observe nature, you watch how the butterfly flies, you watch the bumblebee and how he collects pollen out of a flower. You pick up rocks and see what happens when you drop them. If you drop a rock and a leaf, do they fall at the same time? So doing all these kinds of things out in nature, using natural materials, but really learning about the environment around them is a fantastic way to add in hands-on science with your younger kiddos. And then the other thing you can do is science-related projects. So if you've got, a STEM camp that you want to have the kids go to once a month, or you can do things like habitat dioramas or extra projects that you can do that kind of bring in the practical side of science. So that's our first key, where we're presenting hands-on science. And our second key, the second thing we're going to do each week, is to present scientific information. So science is a marriage of facts and applications. So we talked about our applications with doing our hands-on activities. Now we need to teach them the facts. So they need to know what's true. They need to see what's true. Where can you get this kind of information? Lots of different sources. We live in an age where we can get information at our fingertips from lots of different resources. So you can use things like living books. Usually we think of living books for history, like historical biographies and things like that, but there are a few living books out there for science. You need to look for books that are written by an authority. Stephen Hawking has a series, and that would definitely be a good way to learn about black holes. You need to look for stuff that's interesting. So if your kids don't like Madam How and Lady Why, which is a much older scientific living book, don't read it to them. They're not going to enjoy it. It's not fun. So let's not use it with them. And then we've written the Sassafras Science Adventures as an optional scientific living book. So there are options out there for you. Then the other thing you can use is nonfiction books from your library. So the Let's Read It and Find Out series has a fantastic series of books, especially for like first, second, third grade, where they give scientific information at the level of your kiddos. And then also The Cat in the Hat has a series, and they're just silly books, but you'd be surprised how much your kids pick up from these nonfiction books that they enjoy. So you can look for those when you go to the library. And then the other thing you can use is children's encyclopedias, not the big world book set that you used to have on your shelf. I'm talking about those by D.K., Usborne, Kingfisher. There are lots of children's encyclopedias out there that you can use to gather information for your students that they can learn about the facts of science. So we've got our first key of hands-on science, we've got our second key of gathering information, and we've got our third key, which is to record what they've learned. So students are far more likely to remember what they've learned if they write it down. So writing it down makes a big difference between how much they remember and how much they forget. So we like to recommend notebooking, or the style of recording is notebooking. You can do this in a couple of different ways. You can use things like lap books, which are great, especially as they're younger, because there's less white space on the mini books. Basically, a lap book is a scrapbook. So it's a collection of little mini books that can fit in a file folder or in their lap. And these are great for kindergarten through about first or second grade because they're small. There isn't a lot of white space for them to write on. They can color a little bit if they want, and they can kind of watch it come alive as they learn. So lap books are a great resource. If your older kids, third, fourth, fifth grade, they'll work for them too. Just expect a little bit more in them. Then we have notebooks, and this has basically two components. So this is typically what you would think of in notebooking. Really, lap books are a very simple form of notebooking, but anytime you're doing notebooking, you're having a material content, which is what they're writing, what the students found interesting, what they learned from the reading. It'll be in their own words, and then you will have a visual component, which will be a picture from what they've learned, some kind of visual representation about what you studied. So that's what your notebooks are going to look like. And then you can have journals. So journals can be just a personal record of your nature study time. You can write down what you saw, where you saw it, what time of year it was. All those kinds of things can be written in the nature journal. So now that we understand what those three keys are, you're doing some kind of hands-on science, you're doing some kind of gathering information, and some kind of writing it down. And you can throw in a few extras, things like art projects, STEM projects, posters, videos, additional activities, memory work, all those things. You can add in that stuff if your kids need more. But basically, you need to hit those three key things. But what does that actually look like? So there's lots of different nitty-gritty, how we pull it all together, options. My homeschool is not going to look like your homeschool, and that's fine. And it doesn't mean that you're not covering what you need to cover for science. It just means that you prefer to do it in a different way than what works for us. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's the beauty of the tapestry of homeschoolers that are out there. And we have so many interesting ideas and unique ways to teach our children to reach them where they're at. So I'm going to talk about 4 different ways or 4 different pictures of what science could look like in the elementary years. And my goal is that by explaining these 4 kind of broad options or 4 broad models, it'll kind of help you to see which option could work for you, which option would be best in your homeschool, or you can really create an eclectic mix of all of them. In the end, the method you choose to teach science will depend upon the interests of your students, and it will also depend upon your strengths as a teacher. No one way is better than the other. Like I said, it's really just dependent upon which method fits your homeschool the best. And that's why we say that curriculum is meant to be a tool and not your master, because we should shape the programs that we have or the programs that we use to fit our unique situations. So, with that in mind, let's talk about first what I have used for years and what I love, the classical method. So with that said, let's take a look at doing science within the classical model. So when you teach science within the classical model, your week is centered on demonstrations that are enhanced with reading from visually appealing encyclopedias and notebooking. And then you also add in the classical education hallmarks of memory work and maybe a few projects here and there. So again, what is classical education? Well, classical education is a model that focuses on teaching the students to think critically and training them to be familiar with how to learn. Okay? So it's not just rote memorization or anything like that, like sometimes classical education is looked at. It's really a way to teach your children over the years that you have them at home to think critically and to train them how to be familiar with learning on their own. You want them to be able to learn on their own when they leave your homeschool. So that's the end goal. You're working yourself out of a job, which we're all doing as homeschooling mamas. We're all working ourselves out of a job. So where can you learn more about classical education? I highly recommend The Well-Trained Mind by Jessie Wise and Susan Wise Bauer. It's my favorite classical education resource, and it really gives you a roadmap for classical education from the grammar stage through the rhetoric stage. You can also look at Home Education by Charlotte Mason, The Core, exploring, I think it's Teaching to the Trivium. So those are all options to learn more about classical education if you want to do that. You kind of encompass everything, but sometimes science is seen as more of a weaker side offshoot subject of classical education, something we have to teach even though we're really focusing on history and Latin. But it doesn't have to be that way. If we focus on teaching these 3 keys, putting these 3 keys together in a classical way. So first thing you're going to do a hands-on demonstration. So I'm going to kind of walk you through what it looked like for us to use a classical model for elementary science and using the program Chemistry for Grammar Stage, which is what I wrote so we could do classical science in our own homeschool. So this glimpse is from the periodic table unit. Our week begins with a demonstration where we cleaned pennies using an acid of one of the nitrogen elements, phosphoric acid, which you can find in cola. So the second day, so that's what we did for the first day, and then we talked a little bit about the experiment, and at this point, or the demonstration, at this point my son wasn't really writing too much, so I think we probably wrote down a little bit here and there, but I think I did all the writing for him on his lab sheet. The second day, we read about nitrogen elements from the assigned book. So we chatted about what the elements in the group were like. We decided to add the following to his notebooking page, which was, the nitrogen elements are a mishmash. Some of the elements are gas and some of them are solid. That was what he learned from what we read. That was in his own words at the time he was in 3rd grade. So I'm not expecting too much from his narration, from what he learned. And I did help him pick out that some were gas and some were solid. So I let him kind of come up with what he wanted for his narration, and then I helped kind of enhance it a little bit. So then we added the nitrogen elements to his periodic table poster. Then I helped him kind of enhance it a little bit with information I wanted him to remember. So then we added the nitrogen elements to his periodic table poster, and we worked on memorizing the periodic table poem. So the third day, we read about nitrogen again, and we added what he learned to his notebooking page. So then we went over the week's vocabulary, then we watched a suggested video on the nitrogen cycle, and the day after that we did the same for phosphorus and continued to review the periodic poem. So that's how our week with classical science looked like. But basically, you are doing hands-on science, you're doing some kind of demonstration and experiment. You are reading from children's encyclopedias to learn about whatever the topic was you're studying for the week. And then you are going to write, you're going to discuss and write about what you learned. You can move from them copying their narration to dictating it to having them write it on their own over the years in elementary years. And then you add in a bit of memory work. So that's a simple look at how classical science can work. Second, let's go ahead and take a look at the living books method. All right, so a second picture or a second look at how you could teach science in your home would be the living books method. So what is a living book? Well, a living book is a book that engages the reader and draws him into learning more about a certain subject. So the idea for teaching science using living books is that an interesting living book takes center stage for science. So what the student learns from the living book is then fleshed out through the use of things like demonstrations and through the use of keeping a record. And if you want, some additional books and maybe some projects and memory work and so on and so forth. So you can use classic living books such as the Burgess Bird Book for children, or you can use more modern options like the Sassafras Science Adventures. So here's what a week using living books for elementary science looked like for us. So when we did this, we used Sassafras Science Adventures Volume 2, Anatomy. Our son was 7 years old, and I was training for my first 5K. So I made use of the audiobook, and it read for me while I ran. This is one of the perks of using a living book for teaching science. So we did science twice a week at this time, and on the first day, our son listened to the first part of Chapter 2 while I read on the treadmill. After I was done running, we opened his lap book and chatted about the skeletal system, which was the focus of the chapter. So he wanted to add on the purpose page that the job of the skeletal system was to keep us from being floppy. So I wrote that down for him. Again, I said he was 7 years old, so he wasn't really writing much on his own. And then we stapled this booklet together and glued it in to his lap book. So I already knew what was going on in the story, so we discussed a little bit of the storyline around the section that the science was shared, because I wanted to jog his memory about what the story was actually about. So we talked about the story. We laughed a little bit about some of the things that were going on in there. There was a tooth etched with a picture on it, and we were laughing about that. And then I asked him what he remembered about the skull. Then he shared a couple of facts about what he remembered about the skull, and we did a little mini book to write in his lap book. And what he wrote this time was, "It protects the brain, and the skull is hard." So again, I wrote that down for him, and he colored the front of his mini book, and we put that in his lap book, and that was the end of our first day. So on the second day, I actually read the second part of the chapter out loud while he built with Magna-Tiles. The other thing that's good about using living books is that you can let your kids play with Legos, Magna-Tiles, anything to keep their hands busy. And it looks like they're not listening, but they are. They'll come up with quite a lot afterwards. So when I read a living book to my kiddos, whether that's in science or in history, I usually give them something to do with their hands, whether they're coloring, whether they're building something, but something that they can keep their little hands busy, their little bodies busy, so that their minds can listen. So he wanted to add on his facts page about the skeletal system, that it had 206 bones. So I wrote that for him. And then we talked a little bit again about the section of the chapter where the information was, because I wanted to jog his memory. And then I had him write down a little bit, we talked about the backbone, and his narration for that was, "The backbone holds us up. It's made of vertebrae." And so we wrote that down for him, and then we glued that backbone mini book into his lap book. And finally, we did the week's demonstration, which was a support system. Basically, you use toothpicks up in marshmallows to demonstrate the benefits of having a backbone. So you do one stack of marshmallows without that toothpick and one stack with the toothpick, and it helps the students to see that that backbone really helps to hold us straight. It's a hands-on application of that. On that particular day, I didn't have marshmallows, so we used hot dog buns. And you can do that. You can substitute ingredients and continue on with the demonstration or experiment, whether you have everything or not. So basically, when you use a living book for science, you're reading a section, so you're reading from the living book, it will be sharing the scientific information and the key facts that you need to learn. So you'll start with that reading, and then you'll discuss what you learned. Usually, if you're reading a longer chapter, you might want to go back to what that section was about, kind of remind your students, ask a couple of questions about the storyline, and then ask the questions about the fact. So they will read it, you'll discuss it, then they will write down what they learned. Whether you're doing that in a lap book or notebook, it's up to you. They can write or you can write, whatever their abilities are out, so wherever their abilities are. And then you'll write something to remember while you go over vocabulary and memory work, and then you'll do a related hands-on science demonstration. So that can be going out in nature, especially if you're using the Burgess Bird Book. Going out in nature would definitely be, to look for the bird you read about would definitely be a great option. Or you can do a demonstration. And then you can add in some fun projects. So these can be art projects or just anything that you think will help your kids remember the time they spent learning about XYZ. So this took us about 30 minutes, 2 times a week. The classical method took us about 15, 20 minutes, 4 times a week. So what I'm suggesting for elementary science is really less than an hour a week, an hour of your time each week to learn about science, and you will reap the rewards of that. Let's look at a third method of how we can learn about science, and that's through nature study. Nature study is simply looking at and finding the principles of science in nature. So that's it. You're looking for science in nature. And you can get help with nature study from Nature Explorers by Cindy West, the Handbook of Nature Study. I did a blog for a while called Insta Science at Elemental Blogging. So there are lots of resources out there to help you with nature study. There's new stuff coming up all the time. Nature Study Hackers. But yeah, there are lots of options to help you engage in nature study through the week. So every once in a while, we like to take a little bit of time off and do nature study. So when you're teaching science featuring nature study during the elementary years, your lessons are being led by the science you find in nature. The time outside is then enriched by reading science-oriented books, by keeping a journal, and by doing a few extra projects if you want to, and possibly adding in a little bit of memory work. So here is what a week featuring nature study looked like for us. So for this particular week, my plan was to learn more about sedimentary rocks in our area. We don't have a lot of rocks in our area because we live in Florida. So most of the rocks we have are sedimentary. So we took a few hours to hike a trail near our home. It was winter because when you hike in the summer in Florida, it's like hiking on the face of the sun. But when we saw an interesting rock, we would stop, we would observe it, we would take pictures. We'd pull out our local rock field guide and try to identify what we found. On the way back, we'd look for the sedimentary rock sandstone that we had spotted earlier on our hike. And then we stopped there and we sat a little bit off the trail and drew some rocks in our journals and reread the page in the field guide about sandstone. So our then 4th grader wrote on her journal page the date, where we found the rock, and the following sentence: "Sandstone is hard but gritty. It's a sedimentary rock composed mainly of quartz rock particles." I did help her a little bit with that, help her pull out that information during our discussion. Then our younger one was just along for the ride. Later on in the week, we checked a few books from the library about sedimentary rocks and about rock collecting, and we read a few of them together. We chatted about the rocks we remembered from our hike. Then we worked together to add pictures of the rocks we had identified to a poster that we were creating about rocks in our area. So we reviewed the definition of sedimentary rock, worked a bit on a poem about the different types of rocks that we were memorizing, and that's about how our week worked. So the one day took an hour or so for the hike, but that counted as PE too. And then we spent about 20 minutes during the rest of the week. So basically, when you're doing nature study, you are doing a walk with purpose. So formal nature study, you're doing that walk with purpose. You're going out looking for something specific. So whether you're looking for rocks or spiders or whatever it is you're looking to observe, but you are going out on this walk with purpose to find that and observing whatever your subject is. Or then once you find the subject, you are reading from field guides, you're looking up on the internet for resources you can find, and you're reading a little bit about the subject with your students. And then you'll discuss it and have them write down some facts and what they learned in their nature journal. Usually I require my kids to write the date and at least one fact about the subject. So that can be it. You don't have to do anything else, but if you want to later on in the week, you can add in another book about the subject. You can add in related projects and stuff like that. So that's how a nature study can look like. If you only want to do science once a week, nature study is a great option for you. So finally, we have what we call the unit study method. And a unit study allows you to teach science in bite-sized chunks. So you're looking at one subject for 4 or 5 weeks. Lots of different resources for this. You can do lap books, you can do units, lots of different ways that you could just pick up a book that you get from the library that your kids are interested in and follow a rabbit trail. But when you piece together a unit for teaching science during the elementary years, you're exploring topics that either the student is interested in or things that you want to cover. And you can do this by creating or purchasing a plan that will share about the topic using scientific demonstrations, books, notebooking, and then you can add in projects and memory work if you want. So we did a week piecing together a unit for our elementary science right before we went to Iceland. At the time, our son was super interested in volcanoes, and we were taking our daughter on her senior trip to Iceland. So we figured it was the perfect time to take a break and do a unit on volcanoes. So we pulled together a quick lap book on the subject using National Geographic Reader's Volcanoes as our guide. So on Monday through Thursday of that particular week, we'd read a few pages from the volcano book and add a short narration to one of the mini books that I had created. And then we glued the mini book into the lap book and finished our time by going over any new vocabulary that was introduced or making cards for the words and adding those cards to the vocabulary pocket. Then the last day of the week, we spent quite a bit of time making and painting a volcano to explode in our backyard. So in between the drying times, we'd review the vocabulary, look over the lap book we made, and then we also read Volcanoes by Let's Read and Find Out series that we had gotten from the library. And once the volcano was ready, we exploded it several times in the backyard. But basically, when you piece together a unit, you spend time reading about the subject and you write down what you've learned in a lap book, a notebook, or a journal, and then you do some kind of hands-on science activity or a large project and some vocabulary to add into what you guys learned. So for us, it took about 10 minutes a day, except for like an hour on the last day. So it can take a little bit longer depending on the kind of project you choose or demonstration you choose to do with a unit study. But basically, when you are doing unit studies, the first thing you're doing in your week is you are reading from some kind of source of information, whether that is a nonfiction book you've gotten from the library, whether that's a magazine article that you found interesting and you want to learn more about the subject. But you're reading something and then you are writing about it in a related mini book or notebook or whatever, something short and sweet with your unit. So you're going to read, you're going to discuss and write, and then you're going to do a related demonstration. So you're going to read about plants, you're going to do a little mini book about plants, you're going to do a demonstration that has to do with plants, and then you can add in some more projects like planting a whole garden. So that's how a unit study could be put together. So again, you're hitting all these 3 keys. You are doing something for science, you are reading about science, and you're writing about science. No matter what that looks like in your homeschool or how that's fleshed out in your homeschool, you are always going to be doing these 3 key things. So although there are many different methods for teaching elementary science, your goals remain the same. And because of this, you can teach science at home. So in a nutshell, you're going to spark your students' interest in science and fill their knowledge bucket with scientific information. And don't forget that it's okay to try out different methods of teaching science to see which one fits you best, as long as you're sure that you hit all those 3 keys. You do some kind of hands-on science, you gather some scientific information, and you write down what you've learned each week. And if you have time, you can sprinkle in those remaining projects and memory work to spice up that science learning time. But when you teach science in this way during the elementary years, your student will develop an interest to learn more. And this will pave the way for a much easier science learning experience in future years. So I hope by now you have a picture of how you can teach science at home. Thanks for coming. I hope you enjoyed this session. We have loads more tips and tools and things to help you teach science at home over at our website, which is elementalscience.com.